Right now, somewhere in the world, a courtroom is in session. There's a judge, there's a prosecutor, there's a defendant sitting in the dock, and a lawyer standing beside them to argue their case. Normal. Boring even. Now picture the exact same scene, except the defendant has been dead for 9 months. His skin has gone gray and waxy. He's wrapped in golden robes that don't quite fit a body anymore. He's been propped upright on a throne so he doesn't slide off it. And standing next to this corpse is a young priest whose job today, whose actual, official, assigned job, is to be the dead man's defense lawyer. This really happened in Rome in the year 897, and the furious man screaming questions at the body was the Pope. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod, the strangest trial in the history of the Church. And to understand how a rotting corpse ends up on trial, you first have to understand one thing. Being Pope back then was one of the most dangerous jobs on earth. We picture the medieval papacy as calm men in robes. Forget that. In the 800s, Rome was a snake pit. Popes didn't just pray. They crowned kings. They made emperors. They picked sides in brutal political wars. And the men they crowned had rivals. Powerful, armed, furious rivals. So a pope who backed the wrong horse could be jailed, blinded, or quietly strangled. The average reign was getting shorter and shorter. Some popes lasted years. Some lasted weeks. Into this mess walked a man named Formosus. He became pope. He crowned one would-be emperor. And then, when the political winds changed, he crowned a rival one too. He made enemies on every side. And then, in 896, before those enemies could get him, Formosus did the one thing that should have put him out of reach forever. He died, peacefully, in his bed. He was buried in St. Peter's with full honors. Case closed. You cannot punish a dead man, or so everyone assumed, because a few months later, the throne passed to a new pope, Stephen VI. And Stephen was tied body and soul to the faction Formosus had betrayed. He didn't just dislike his predecessor. He wanted him erased, punished, humiliated. But here was Stephen's problem. The man he hated was already gone, buried, beyond reach. A normal person would grit their teeth and move on. Stephen VI was not a normal person. Stephen looked at that grave and thought, who says the trial needs a living defendant? So he gave an order that made his own clergy go pale. Go to St. Peter's, open the tomb, and bring me Formosus. Picture the men sent to do it. 9 months in the ground, they lift the lid, and they have to reach in, lift out what's left of a former pope, and carry him across Rome to stand trial. The smell alone must have been unbearable. They did it anyway. When the order comes from the Pope himself, you do not get to say no. They didn't just drag him in as he was. No, this had to look like a real court. So they dressed the corpse. Full papal vestments. The robes, the symbols, everything a living pope would wear. They sat him upright on a throne in the great hall of the Lateran. They arranged his stiff hands, and because every defendant has the right to a defense, they grabbed a young deacon, stood him beside the body, and told him, "You will speak for him. You are his lawyer now." Imagine being that deacon. Imagine being told your client is a 9-month-old corpse, the prosecutor is the living pope, and the verdict has already been decided. Then it began, and it was not dignified. Stephen stood in front of the body and screamed. He hurled questions at the corpse, demanding answers, accusing it of crimes. Why did you take the papacy unlawfully? Why did you covet this throne? And when the dead man predictably said nothing, the terrified deacon had to mumble a defense on his behalf, while Stephen raved and mocked and answered for the corpse in a sneering little voice. And the hall was packed. Bishops, cardinals, clergymen, all summoned to watch, none of them brave enough to walk out. They stood frozen as their own pope interrogated a body, and not a single one of them dared say out loud what every person in that room was surely thinking. The charges sounded official. Perjury, taking the papacy illegally, holding offices he shouldn't have. But here's the part that reveals what this was really about, and it's coldly clever in the worst way. In the medieval church, every act a pope performed was only valid because he was valid. Every priest Formosus had ordained, every bishop he'd appointed, every king he'd crowned, All of it was legitimate only because Formosus had been a real pope. So if Stephen could prove Formosus was never a true pope at all, then every single thing he'd ever done simply evaporated. Every rival he'd crowned, every enemy he'd empowered, gone, unmade, with one verdict. This wasn't madness. This was a weapon. Stephen was using a dead body to delete his enemy's legitimacy. The corpse on the throne was just the tool. And the verdict, you already know, guilty on every count. Now came the sentence. And this is where it tips from a political trial into something out of a nightmare. Stephen declared all of Formosus's acts null and void. Then he ordered the 3 fingers of the corpse's right hand cut off, the same fingers a pope raises to give a blessing. He had the papal robes stripped away and the body redressed in cheap rags. And then the former pope, the man who had worn the highest crown in Christendom, was dragged out and thrown into the river Tiber like garbage. Stephen must have felt triumphant. He'd won. He'd done the impossible. He'd punished a dead man. And that is exactly when it all came apart. Because Rome had been watching and screaming at a corpse, mutilating it, and dumping a former pope in the river was a bit much, even for the snake pit of medieval Rome. The mood turned, fast. Whispers spread that the body had been pulled from the Tiber by a monk, and that it had started performing miracles. A hermit, the story went, had recovered the broken body from the riverbank and kept it safe, and the sick who came near it were healed. To the people, that meant one thing. Formosus was innocent, and Stephen had desecrated a holy man. A dead man he had tried to erase was suddenly more beloved than ever. The city rose up. The same crowds that had feared Stephen now turned on him. He was seized, stripped of his own power, and thrown into prison. And there, just months after he'd put a corpse on trial, Pope Stephen VI was strangled to death in his cell. The man who refused to let a dead enemy rest outlived him by less than a year. And the Church. The Church was so horrified by what had happened that it did something remarkable. A later pope formally annulled the Cadaver Synod. Formosus was pardoned, his body recovered and reburied in St. Peter's with full honors, and his acts restored as if the trial had never happened. And to make sure no one ever tried this again, the Church passed a flat rule. You may never again put a dead person on trial. They had to make an actual law, specifically to ban this. So the next time you think you're holding a grudge, that you just can't let something go, remember Pope Stephen VI. Remember that he hated a man so completely that death itself wasn't enough. He dug up the body, dressed it, screamed at it, mutilated it, and threw it in a river to win an argument with someone who could no longer argue back. And for all that effort, 1100 years later, almost nobody remembers the politics or the emperors or who crowned whom. We just remember the dead pope propped on a throne with a lawyer. History's pettiest grudge, and it backfired so completely that it got its own law.